Genetics has a wild sense of humour. Imagine looking exactly like your great-grandmother from 1895 while sharing 60% of your DNA with a banana. Today, we're exploring why family resemblance is way more complicated than we think. That banana fact never fails to amaze me. And speaking of surprising genetics, I just read about identical twins who ended up looking noticeably different just because one became a marathon runner. Well, that's where epigenetics comes in. The science showing how our environment and choices can actually modify how our genes express themselves. Recent studies suggest that up to 40% of our physical traits can be influenced by environmental factors. So you're saying our genes aren't exactly destiny? Not entirely. Think of DNA like this massive cookbook passed down through generations. Each recipe is a gene, but how that recipe turns out depends on the ingredients available and the conditions in your kitchen. Research from Stanford showed that identical twins' DNA can diverge by up to 5.2% over their lifetime. That cookbook analogy really helps explain why siblings can look so different. It's like each time, you're pulling different recipes from this enormous collection. Exactly. And here's something fascinating. Scientists have discovered that about 8% of our genetic code comes from ancient viruses that became permanently integrated into our DNA millions of years ago. Well, that's definitely not something they teach you in basic biology class. How does this relate to why some kids look nothing like their parents? So get this, we inherit about 50% of our DNA from each parent, but the specific genes we get are completely random. It's like shuffling 2 decks of cards and dealing out a new hand each time. Studies show there's a 1 in 4 chance that siblings will inherit the same version of any particular gene. And then there's that whole thing with recessive genes, right? Like how 2 brown-eyed parents can have a blue-eyed child. Oh yeah, and that's actually more common than people think. About 8% of brown-eyed parents carry the recessive gene for blue eyes. But what's really interesting is how these traits can skip generations. The latest research suggests we carry active genetic information from up to 10 generations back. That explains why someone might suddenly look like their great-great-grandmother. Nature playing the long game. Speaking of the long game, scientists have found that certain environmental factors during pregnancy can actually influence gene expression in ways that can be passed down for several generations. A study in Sweden showed that food availability during a grandfather's childhood could affect his grandchildren's longevity. Well, that adds a whole new level of responsibility to lifestyle choices, doesn't it? It really does. And here's another mind-bending fact. What scientists used to call junk DNA makes up about 98% of our genome. Turns out it's not junk at all, but rather sophisticated regulatory elements that influence how other genes work. Like the margin notes in that cookbook analogy, they might seem random, but they're actually crucial to how the recipe turns out. Precisely. And recent studies using AI have identified over 5,000 previously unknown genetic patterns that influence how traits are expressed. We're just scratching the surface of understanding how complex inheritance really is. You know what's fascinating? How different cultures interpret these family resemblances. Oh yes, anthropological studies have shown that some cultures see strong family resemblances as a sign of ancestral blessing, while others believe physical traits can skip generations because of spiritual influences. The science might be universal, but the cultural interpretations are incredibly diverse. That really shows how deeply these patterns of inheritance affect human society, doesn't it? And with modern DNA testing, we're discovering just how interconnected we all are. Studies suggest that any 2 humans share about 99.9% of their DNA. We're all much more closely related than we might think. So between our shared DNA and our banana cousins, we're basically one big family. Well, that's the beautiful thing about genetics. It shows us how we're all connected through this incredible 4 billion year story of life on Earth. Thanks for joining us today on Flourish the Mind YouTube channel, where we've explored the surprising science of family resemblance. And remember, next time you see someone who looks exactly like their great uncle, you're witnessing millions of years of genetic history coming together